Our entryway has this bench. Not a bad bench, but it's just not my wife's favorite. Let's change that. I had this off-cut piece of walnut veneered MDF lying around. Seemed like a good use for this, so we'll start to break it down. The table will be 15 inches deep, so I'll begin by ripping it down to 15 inches. The veneer is thin, and I didn't want to have the table saw blades cause any chipping. I covered it with some painter's tape for the first cut. It turns out I didn't really need it. MDF is much more stable than solid wood, and I'm okay with using it for this table. To cover the edges, we're going to use an iron-on edge banding. This is super easy to use, but I need an iron. I tried to get my wife's good iron to use, but was gently told no. I had to turn to an iron used for waxing skis, but it managed to do the job. Really just a matter of ironing on the veneer, then trimming it off. I had this handy veneer trimming tool that someone gave me, and it worked great. A little sanding and it's good to go. I got through that whole process for the top, only to realize that I had forgotten to trim down the length of the board. When I did, I didn't use masking tape. Cutting across the grain is where the tear out occurs. Time to tape it up and trim just a hair off the end. I've got this rough milled walnut board that I'm using for the legs. First step is to break it down into about 36-inch pieces using the miter saw. I don't have a planer, so I used a jig to clamp down the wood and run it through the table saw. The straight edge of the plywood runs against the fence, and that helps to clean up the wonky edge of the walnut. After that, I can adjust my fence to 2 inches and rip down the boards. I ran these boards through the planer to get them to an even thickness. Thank goodness I've got a neighbor with good tools like a surface planer. Now it's time to glue up the boards for the legs. We're gluing 2 boards together to form a 1.5-inch thick leg. The board wasn't quite 1 inch thick when I purchased it and had to be planed down quite a bit to get it flat. These silly clamps are tricky. I can't figure them out. Oh. Thanks. After some glue scraping, I can run the boards through the table saw to get down to the final thickness. It's important to lay out these legs and ensure the best part is facing forward. I also need to get them to the same length, which means trimming one edge, then establishing a stop to cut the legs at the table saw. Unfortunately, my miter saw isn't very accurate because this would have been much easier to do there. I'd like to add a small taper to 2 faces of these legs. To do so, I'm going to mark what I'd like to see for a small taper. To make the cuts on the table saw, we're going to use another jig or sled to run it through. This is more scrap plywood that I had that will run along the fence. I'm tacking on some small pieces of wood to hold the legs in place in order to get a more consistent cut. I use another leg to help clamp the wood down to the sled. Lots of work here for a single cut, but it's worth it to get consistency across all 4 legs. Once the final cuts are made, I made a slight modification to the sled, and then I can run the pieces through again. This gives me the final taper on the bottom of the leg. We're adding a shelf to the middle of the table, so I'm going to use my CNC to cut some slots in the legs to hold the shelf. I first need to mark the spots, so I cut down a scrap to mark a consistent distance on each of the 4 legs. So here's the setup on the CNC machine. We've got a clamp here to hold this down. We've got some tape to hopefully stop some tear out. Got more clamps and everything set in place. Now it's not entirely necessary to use a CNC to cut these, but I've got it, and it's much more accurate than me using a router and a chisel. Time to sand. Man, these things are noisy. Ah, that's better. I've got the top flipped over, and I'm laying out the legs to have a 1-inch overhang, and that way I can measure to get the size of the apron pieces. I'll cut those out while my most reliable employee is working next to me. Once those are trimmed to size and edge banded, it's time to drill the pocket holes so that they can be attached to the legs and the top. I've got some scraps of 1/8 inch plywood to space the apron pieces slightly back from the legs. It's time to measure for the middle shelf. I cut and edge banded the shelf off camera. With the 2 side pieces assembled, I'm going to attach the front and back pieces while inserting the middle shelf. It's kind of tricky to get it all together before the glue dries. Before I fit the top on, I'd like to add some steel in the back. I'll need to drill some holes to insert the 1/4 inch steel rods. In order to do so, I modeled up the dimensions of the opening and created a couple of small jigs to help with the assembly. The first gives me the angle of the drill, while the second is going to help me to weld the pieces together. The steel needs to be cleaned off with some acetone. The first steel rod goes in without a problem. The next one needs to be cut in half where the pieces intersect. When I have the pieces cut and in place, I can use the second little jig to help line up the steel. This will keep everything in place while I weld it together. My welds are about as good as it gets for a guy that barely knows what he's doing. However, as long as they stick together and don't look horrible, you hope that no one notices. A little cleanup with the grinder, some files, and sandpaper helps to make it look, well, reasonable. The last piece of the assembly is to attach the top. I'm not going to glue it at this point. It's not necessary, and it will make it easier to replace the top if I ever want to do something with solid wood or maybe a little fancier. Time to apply the finish. There's really nothing more satisfying than seeing the walnut pop. It also means that you're one step closer to being done with this project. I apply 5 coats of finish, sanding in between. With some pads on the feet, we can put this table where it belongs. Like I said at the beginning, this isn't an heirloom piece with intricate details. But I like it. More importantly, my wife likes it. Happy birthday, dear. Sorry that it's a month late. You wanna try it?
Sure.
Use this little guy.
Oh my gosh, that's adorable.